Let's turn our attention now to the client side of the equation. For all the client code, we are using a library called Vue.js, which is a framework for building single-page applications, rich internet applications, whatever you want to call them, Web 2.0 applications. It has parity with other libraries that you might have heard of called React and Angular. One of the things I like about Vue is it kind of walks a line between complexity and ease of use and ease of learning, and including kind of common functionality so you don't have to bolt a bunch of other stuff onto it. Vue is a component-based architecture, so you can build components that do all manner of things in the user interface and reuse them and compose them together to provide richer functionality to your user. One of the neat things about Vue is it's got a really good set of documentation. So if you go to the website and choose Guide here, this would be very well worth your time to just walk through how Vue works, what it is, how it's hooked up, to kind of set the stage for doing development on Corpus Christi. There's a bunch of other information too here, more of a reference guide and the Vue API and some other things. But this guide right on its own does a great job of introducing what Vue is and what it can do. And if you're more inclined to look at videos about stuff, there's a ton of tutorials about Vue that you can find in the usual places. Other things that come from the Vue team that aren't Vue itself include this guy, the Vue Dev Tools. This is a browser extension that works, as you can see down here, in Chrome and Firefox. It doesn't work in Microsoft browsers, but you can also download a standalone app that's built with Electron that will do the same kinds of things without having to be integrated into the browser. But I've found it to be super helpful in Chrome. I've used Chrome for a long time. I've been using Brave lately, but it's based on the same engine as Chrome, so all of the Chrome extensions work in Brave. And this is one of the best for doing Vue development. In particular, it shows you, as the illustration here has, you can see kind of the hierarchy of these Vue components. So there's a root component, there's a status bar, there's a project homepage, there's different sorts of things you can kind of infer from the structure here, whatever they are. But it will show you the way that the user interface is just laid out. And then it also will give you insight into the state of the various components that you're using. So this data entry here is telling us the values of various things that are defined in this particular connection status component that's highlighted here. And that makes it really handy for debugging. What you end up doing is you can kind of tell from the top here that a lot of these entries in this tab bar should look familiar from the standard browser development tools, so Elements and Console and Network and stuff. When you install this extension, it basically just shows up as a new tab inside of your browser dev tools. So this is super helpful. And if you haven't already discovered this, I'd really encourage you to download this and add it to your browser. It just makes debugging a ton easier. Another piece of functionality from the Vue people is called the Vue router, and this is a piece of Vue that allows you to connect the components that you're seeing on the page with the address bar or the URL that's being shown in your browser. A goal of a single page application is to kind of make use of all the capabilities of a browser. And without a router, what happens is the URL for that single page application is just kind of the main page. And as you navigate from place to place within the application on the browser, the URL in the address bar won't be updated. And that means that if you want to do a bookmark, if you want to get back to the same page that you were on previously across browser sessions and that kind of stuff, you really can't do that because all the mechanisms around returning you to the appropriate page are based on the behavior of the address bar. So the router allows us to kind of connect the address bar to the page that we're looking at, and also throws in some things like allowing you to do navigation guards so that you can prevent users from getting to pages that they're not supposed to be getting to, and other sorts of things like that to make it easier to allow people to navigate around. So router is kind of a generic term. It's not super great one, I don't think, for this purpose, but it's kind of a standardized term for this functionality. It might be better called a sitemap or something like that, because it connects things in the site to the URL. So we make use of that to navigate around inside of Corpus Christi. And then another component that's, again, built by the Vue core team, so it works really well with Vue, is called Vuex. And this is a state management library. The idea here is that inside of any non-trivial application, you're going to want to keep track of state. Who's logged in? What credentials do they have? What roles are they allowed to, or what roles do they have that allow them to do things in the application? When did they last make a request? You can put any kind of stateful information that kind of controls the way the application as a whole behaves. And what Vuex is a way to kind of manage that state. The reason that you don't normally just kind of go it on your own and stick things in a global variable is the same reasons that we have come to disdain the use of global variables in general, right? This notion of, for example, is somebody logged in? Well, you could certainly define a global variable that could be accessed from anywhere inside the application that said yay or nay, is somebody logged in? You could use that to determine, what pages the user can navigate to, what information to show in the navigation bar, what options are available in the flyout tab on the left-hand side of our application. But global variables are bad, right? Because they can be changed from any place in unexpected ways and result in sort of weird action at a distance when a component goes rogue. What Vuex does is it provides global state, but it does it in a really controlled way. So the only way that you can change global state that's managed by Vuex is by intentionally making a function call that Vuex will keep track of. So you can actually see the history of all the state changes, where they came from, when they took place, and use that information as a debugging tool to say, hey, at this point, the global state was correct. 2 clicks later, it was wrong. Let's go see what happened between those 2 clicks and who might have actually gotten in there to make change to the global state that we didn't expect. Another neat thing about using Vuex for that is that you can actually kind of it's called time travel debugging, because it can keep a history of all the changes to global state. You can use the Vuex DevTools extension that I showed you a minute ago and actually kind of dial back and forth through time to see the application itself at various points in the past and inspect kind of what was happening at that point. So it's another really super helpful way of doing debugging. So it kind of takes all the negatives that are normally associated with global variables and turns it into kind of a positive that gives you the strength of globals in terms of accessibility, but also constraining who can make changes to those global variables in order to prevent you from shooting yourself in the foot. The final part of the user interface that we use from a third party is called Vuetify. Vue itself allows you to create components and do all sorts of great functionality with those components and integrate your JavaScript with the user interface and stuff in really neat ways. But it doesn't do anything in terms of styling or layout or those types of things that we want to have in an application. Now, there's, I think, an argument to be made that says you can, do all of your own component styling and CSS and all that kind of stuff. But we're really more interested in producing an application that, works for our end users. And so rather than spending a bunch of time trying to do our own UI, we're just adopting Vuetify. And I've used this on a variety of different projects, including Corpus Christi, and have been very happy with its performance and its flexibility, and it's being maintained, and it actually follows a standard called material design, which is something that came out of Google, and it's sort of the way that they specify how to build and how to style web-based applications as well as mobile applications. So it's standards compliant. It works great with Vue. You can tell that kind of from the name. It is not a project from the Vue core team. All of the other things that we've just talked about actually are built by the same people who build Vue itself. This is a third-party add-on, and there is a couple of them. There's another one called Quasar that I like quite a lot. But we've kind of standardized on using Vuetify. So anytime you see a menu or a dialog box or a drop-down or anything like that in the application, those are Vuetify components that are being used by Vue to provide display of information to our end users. Let's take a look at some source code for the user interface. I'm back here in my IDE at the top level of the tree, and the UI directory is where all of the user interface stuff is stored. So let's drill down into that. There's some kind of standard pieces and parts that configure the application. Let me show you one thing here, the index.html page. This is the top level page for our application. And you will notice that it's remarkably Spartan. We're doing a few things like loading up fonts and stuff like that in the head part of the HTML document, but the only no script portion of the body is this one div with an ID of app. So the way that the Vue application works is you tell it to attach itself to a particular location in your HTML, and this ID app div is that place. So when we start looking at the code for the application itself, we'll see that it actually sort of inserts itself at this point in the HTML page. And so the sparseness of the page shouldn't concern us. It's got a little bit of Corpus Christi specific things, right? The title and a message that says, sorry, you got to use JavaScript in order to run this. But there's not really much else that's there. But that is the top level page. So it's a little disconcerting in a way if you like open up a Vue-based app and do Vue source. Pretty much all you'll see is this, and it's just not quite clear where the there is there. So the there is inside the source directory here. So we've got some kind of standard layout here for source trees in a Vue application, a collection of components, and we'll maybe come and look inside that a little bit more. But these are kind of things that aren't really, page-wide kinds of things. They're things that you're going to plug in elsewhere that you can use on a page. I use a directory called layouts, which is basically kind of the overall structure of the application. Each page that you navigate to within the single page app is going to drop itself into a layout. So the layout kind of forms the border around the app, if you will. Things like the top level nav bar, the footer, the menu on the left, that kind of stuff, that's mostly specified in a layout. And if we chose to have a different layout, we could add more of those. The pages directory is where the individual pages that you can navigate to live. So when you click something in the navigation bar, the flyout on the left-hand side to go to courses or events or people or whatever, you're switching from one page to another out of this directory. There's some plugins that we use, for example, to configure Vuetify. There's a plugin and so forth. And then the application itself is actually this component right here, app.vue. And the very tippy top level, the thing that actually is going to run and insinuate itself into this div is main.ts. So you can see here that this is actually the main invocation of getting the Vue app to start up. So we're calling new on this Vue object, and one of the things that you'll see here is that there's a method on it called $mount. Vue's convention is that for any kind of internal methods on Vue objects, they prefix them with $sign to kind of distinguish them from things that you've provided. And it's going to build that Vue application, and it's going to mount it at sharp app, right? And the sharp sign, of course, means to look for an ID in an HTML element called app. And in particular, it's going to find this one, right? Here's an ID of app. It's the only one in the whole app. And that means that when this application starts up and the Vue JavaScript gets loaded, it's going to hook itself up right here and take over your browser. So that's the main file. You shouldn't have to monkey with it too much. It imports some other things that we've talked about, though. It imports the Vue router that we use. It imports the Vuex store, is often what you call the Vuex global state information. It imports Vuetify. It also imports Vue i18n, which is the internationalization library that we use within the code base. And then finally, it actually creates the Vue app and mounts it to the top level element in that main HTML page, and then everything starts from there. Let's take another look at this app.vue component that we imported in here and used to kind of fire up the application. So this is, the file extension is a little unusual here. It's .vue, which obviously connects it to Vue, but what does that actually mean? It turns out that when you're working in Vue, you can have a separate file that has the markup for your Vue page, and another file for the JavaScript in that page, and another file for the CSS that might be local to that page. And in order to make them work together, you kind of have to wire them up, but they kind of live in separate files. One of the things that Vue has championed is this notion of what's called a single file component, or an SFC. The idea here is that it collects together the markup and the scripting and the styling into one file. Now that kind of rankles some people when they have gotten used to over the years hearing that you should always keep those things separate. And I think that there's some legitimacy in that we don't want to, for example, be writing a bunch of elaborate JavaScript code inside of an event handler inside of our HTML markup, right? That just makes it hard to debug, hard to read, hard to understand, hard to maintain. So the notion that we should separate things apart into their respective areas does make a great deal of sense. But that doesn't necessarily imply that those different parts have to be in their own files, because it just sort of makes it more complex to try to figure out how those things all work together. So what Vue or .vue files do is they allow you to put in 3 different sections, one that has markup, one that has JavaScript, and one that has styling, CSS. And they live in the same file, but they're in separate sections. And we can see that already by just looking at this app.vue. So for example, this top-level template, that's a Vue-specific HTML tag that's used to encapsulate any of the markup that's going to be used by this particular Vue component. It doesn't really do very much here because this is just kind of getting things kicked off. And then we have, and I'm going to collapse this down here so you can see the whole file. We've got a script tag, and that's a standard JavaScript tag, but what is contained in this script tag is all of the functionality associated with this component. So for example, we can import other pieces and parts from the rest of our application. We can then define the details of the behavior of this component inside of this exported object. And that continues down to the end of the file. You can also have another tag that allows you to put styling directly into this page if you want to override the default CSS for the whole application just for this one page. I find that you don't really use that super often, but it's available to you if you need it. Normally, in our case, because we're using Vuetify, we're just going to use all the styling stuff that comes with Vuetify, and it's pretty rare that we have to resort to our own CSS unless we need to really tweak something that's really specific to a given component. That's available to us, but we aren't going to really use it that often. Let's take a look in the pages directory. So you can see here, as I mentioned before, that these are kind of the top level views, V-I-E-W, it's a little ambiguous, I guess, that you navigate around among when you're working with this application. So you might be looking at diplomas or courses or events or groups or people or places, right? So, and again, these things are all named similarly across the entire code base. So the sections of the data model connect to the sections of the server API implementation, connect to the pages that are part of the single page application. So let's look at one of these. How about people.vue? And this is more elaborate and includes other components and whatnot, but you can still see here we have this structure that has the template tags, which contains all the markup, and then down here a script tag that has all of the business logic associated with this particular component. This one actually has a style section as well that addresses a little bit of a goofy spacing apparently on the bottom of one of the components in this Vue component. So again, you can tweak things if you need to. But let's just kind of look at the other contents of this file. If we focus to start with on the template, the portion that has the markup, one of the things that really stands out in this case is that a lot of these tags start with V dash, and in fact probably all of them. Anytime you see a V dash, that's a Vuetify thing, right? Remember, Vue is the toolkit, and Vuetify is kind of the CSS and styling package that we're using on top of Vue. So Vuetify has as a convention to just name everything with a leading V dash, so you kind of always tell what you're looking at. So in this case, we're using a container object that basically spans this whole section of the component, and then within that container there's some things like the title of the page. There's a table here that lists the individual people that we're looking at, because this is the people page. There's some other information here, a tab that lets us make some changes to the roles that we're viewing, and then another table that shows the roles associated with the people in this view. Now, you can also see, in addition to the things that start with V, there's some other components here that obviously are not standard HTML, but are kind of formatted in that way, and these actually correspond to other components that we've built inside of our Vue application. So this person table, if you've opened up the person tab in the application at all, it shows you a list of all the people that are registered with Corpus Christi, and that person table component is what's responsible for showing that view of the people. And if we were to click through this, I think I'll get to the definition of person table. Yep, you can see here that I'm now over here in the file system hierarchy. I've now entered into the components portion of the source tree, and these are kind of reusable pieces and parts that we can use throughout our application. So that person table here is another Vue component, right? So it's got in this case a rather more extensive template because it's displaying a bunch of information about people. Uses a bunch of built-in components from Vuetify that start with a V. And then later on in the file, there is the, somewhere, there is the script. And so here's all the business logic associated with that particular component. And you can see that this is actually using yet other components that we've put together. So there's a dialog that allows us to maintain, wow, that's quite a completion thing. There's a dialog that allows us to maintain a person record, and another that allows us to do administration on a person. So there's a lot of this kind of nested use of components, which is one of the things that really makes development with Vue very pleasant. You can kind of encapsulate the markup and the functionality especially inside of a component. And if you want to just reuse that component elsewhere, you just mention it in the component that's parenting the one you want to use, and the functionality is available to you. So let's go back to that people page. So here's where we were hosting that person table component inside of a tab item on the top level people page over here. And then we have a similar thing with another tab where we show roles, which you can maintain whether somebody's a public user or an administrative user or a translator and so forth. So there's another component that we've built that also displays a tabular view of data about a role. The fact that we have these different components that we can reuse means that we probably want to have a capability of providing specific details to that component when we use it, right? So I might use the person table in several places throughout the application. It might not just be a convenience to sort of skinny down the size of this file, which of course is also a legitimate reason for making a component, just doing that encapsulation. But we want to be able to provide a sufficient amount of information to that person table component to be able to do its job for us in this spot of our application. So this v-bind, you'll notice it. So here's the opening, what looks like an HTML tag, and we know that in open HTML tags we can have properties. So there's properties in here called people list, roles list, table loaded, and fetch people list. And we're basically giving values to these attributes inside of this person table object. And the key thing that gets that gets Vue to know about these things is this v-bind prefix. So when Vue is rendering this, obviously this is not something that can be rendered directly by a browser. So Vue itself at runtime or at compile time, if we're building a production version of our system, is going to convert this person table thing into the underlying HTML that defines this component. And if this component uses other components, as we saw previously, it's going to do the same thing kind of recursively until it gets down to the level of actual HTML elements, and that's what's ultimately going to show up in the browser. So as part of that processing, the person table component can get arguments passed to it essentially, and that's what's going on here. We're going to pass in the people that we want to display, a list of the roles for those people, and these other attributes. Now, so that allows us to tell the people page here to use the person table in this particular way. And if we go back to that person table component, what we'll see here is that there's a section in this scripts object called props. And that's short for properties. And this is basically a way of declaring parameters that you can pass to this component. And as we saw back in the people page, there were things like people list and roles list and table loaded, right? So we're declaring here in the person table component that we expect to get these kinds of values from the component that's using us. And then when we do use this component, the people page itself has to supply values for those attributes, those props. So it's a way to pass things into that component so it can customize itself to display the information that you're looking for. The other thing that's going on here in the person table component is there's another property that uses, instead of vbind, which is like a variable binding, there's also a thing called von. And on should suggest to you like a callback, right? On this event, do something. So this is another Vue thing that allows us to associate a function that we want to have execute when some event takes place inside the person table component. You can read more about the details of that in the Vuetify guide that I pointed you to earlier. Let's take a look at some of the other things that are showing up in the script portion of this Vue component. We can give the script, the component, a name. That's handy because that name will actually show up in the Vue dev tools. So if you don't give it that, it's going to give you some sort of generic component name. When you want to use other components within your component, you have a components entry in this top level object. And as we just saw, we're using a component called person table and one called roles table here. The data entry in this top level object is where we store state for just this component. I mentioned the Vuex state management tool before. That's for maintaining global state. That's all across the whole application, and it has usually relatively little information in it, in most of the apps that I built at least. On the other hand, you almost always have some kind of state information in your components, right? In the case of this people page, we want to be able to show the contents of the people and the roles tables. So we need some place to store that information in order to be able to hand that off to the component that's going to ultimately display it. So what we do in here is we declare an object that has properties that are going to be used to store that kind of information. So people list here is an array that's going to store people objects, and roles list is going to store role objects, and table loaded is going to indicate whether or not we've completed loading the table. And those values then are going to be used to drive the behavior of the component. So let's just think about people list here for a second. We've already seen it being used in the person table, right? Here's people list in the person table. We're passing our local people list as an argument that's going to be bound to a similarly named attribute inside the person table. So we said before that we use vbind to kind of pass parameters into these other components. We're passing them in this case from some of our state that we got probably out of the database in order to be able to tell the person table how to, or not how to display it, but what to display. Notice that most of the things in this top level script configuration object are just direct entries in the object. The data entry is a little bit different. It's supposed to be a function, right? So you can see here that this is actually a defined function whose job it is to return the state information. And the reason for this is these are reusable components. If we just had a single data object across all of, for the people page, if we instantiated that people page twice, they would share that information, which would mean that when we made a change in one page, it would make corresponding changes in the other page, which is probably not what we expect. So this data entry in the top level configuration object is kind of a factory, right? It builds an empty or a pre-populated collection of the state information that's going to be used up here in the template portion or elsewhere in the code. And it stamps out a new one of those for each instance of this page. In our case, we're only going to probably only have one people page open at a time. But when we get down into these individual components that are reused all over the place, we definitely want to observe this convention of returning an object from a function. Another entry here that we have in the top level object is called methods. And this is kind of like defining methods on a class. It's functions that you can call from inside this component to do stuff. And so in this particular case, we've got some methods to fetch the people list. And that's basically now meaning let's fetch the people list, the list of people from the API, right? So it's in these kinds of functions where we finally have a connection between what's going on in the user interface and what's exposed by the Flask server on the API side. So we can fetch people, we can fetch roles, and then those can be used to display stuff through the people table and role table components that we saw up here. Okay, we're going to come back to the details of those guys. One other thing that we see here in this particular component is what's called a lifecycle event. So it's pretty common terminology when you're referring to something that's been added to the DOM in a web page to refer to that as a mounting event. It's like, you've mounted this trophy on your wall, or you've mounted a disk drive under a particular part of the file system or something like that. So the mounted lifecycle event is something that Vue is going to call at the point when it creates this people page and puts it onto the browser screen. And what we want to have happen at that point is to grab the stuff from the database that's going to be displayed in this page. And that basically means invoking these two functions to fetch the list of roles and to fetch the list of people. So we're referring to these two functions, and because these are all inside of the same object, we can refer to them using the much maligned this identifier in JavaScript. So if we want to refer to other things inside the data here, we need to use this as the prefix to make sure that we're accessing the right thing. But what happens then basically is that when this page is displayed, Vue is going to call mounted, which is going to run this code that's going to result in these two functions being called. And what we'll see in a second is that these two functions basically get stuff from the API, and they fill up the people list from here and the roles list from down here. Now, so far so good, but so what? We've fetched the data and we stored it in this section of the component. But how does that help us in terms of getting that information displayed at the screen? Well, it turns out that a key thing about all these user interface toolkits, Vue and Angular and React, is that they are reactive. That's why React is called React. And what we mean by reactive is when you make a change to certain parts of the data in that application, other things happen remotely, right? So what's gonna take place, say when this fetch people list function runs, and it fills in an actual list of people here in this people list data variable, anything that depends on this people list data variable is going to be triggered to update itself. And that happens automatically by the way that Vue is designed. And we know already that that people list is being used up here as an argument to pass to person table. So when this thing changes, because the fetch operation has fished something down from the API, it's going to cause this thing to update, which is going to trigger an update inside the person table. And inside the person table, we're going to be looking at the contents of the data that we passed into its people list property, and that too is reactive. So it's going to trigger an update to the contents of that table on the page. So one of the key things of kind of getting mature at doing this sort of reactive programming is you need to stop thinking about how do I kind of push stuff out into the user interface and learn to rely on this reactive nature of the library and just be content to change the contents of variables that are themselves made reactive by Vue. I think it's fair to say that the singular contribution of these kinds of libraries is to offer us reactivity. Instead of just storing something into a variable, Vue actually wraps those variables up in some decorators that allows for Vue to get an event or to be notified that you're making a change to that. And by the way that you configure these components, Vue kind of builds up a graph that has connections that says, hey, when this variable changes, go update it there. And when that variable changes as a result, maybe you have to update it in other places. And that can kind of cascade through multiple components, but it's all taken care of for us by Vue. So if we wanted to, for example, add a person to the people or to the person table here, we wouldn't like call a method on the person table and tell it go ahead and add this thing. What we would do in our code is just add something to this people list, right? We'd add something to this piece of data inside this page, and the reactivity system is going to force that out to all the components that are dependent upon it. So that's exactly what we're doing here inside of these fetch methods, is we're getting stuff from the API, and then we're changing the contents of these data variables, and then everything that depends on them through the through the Vue dependency system will be updated automatically. So let's see what's going on here. We've got so fetch people list. This is going to go get people from the API. There's this kind of weird, again, these weirdly named things like $HTTP. That is a signal that that's something that's kind of internal to Vue that's sort of treated special. There's nothing particularly goofy about using a $sign in a JavaScript variable. It's a completely legitimate symbol. It's just the convention of Vue to use the $sign as a prefix to mean, hey, something special is going on here. So we'll see in a second that HTTP identifier is actually an HTTP client package. And it defines some methods. So here's a get method that is going to issue a get request to this URL. Okay, so you can see here API v1 people persons. We already kind of looked at the way that the API endpoints are structured on the server. So somewhere down in the server code in the people module, which you now know how to find on the server side, there's going to be an endpoint called people persons, and the job of that endpoint is going to be to go out to the database using SQL Alchemy and fish back all of the people that are known to the system, because we're not putting any constraints like for a particular person. We're trying to get them all. It's going to fish back all those people. It's going to use the Marshmallow schema to vet that and to serialize it and send us back a JSON that's going to come back from this GET request. And here we're using a promise-based interface. So we've got a GET that will eventually return the list of people, and then we'll invoke the then method on that, and we'll pass the response that came back from this GET request into this fat arrow function, and we're going to go inside that response. And the response has multiple attributes or properties on it, like the status code and that kind of stuff. But if there's data that came back from the server, it's going to be in a data property of this top level response object. So we go to the response object and we fish out the data. That's going to actually be the JavaScript object that contains all the people. And what do we do with it? Well, we assign this .people list to that value. So what we're doing is we're updating this reactive variable. And now everything that relies on that, like our component here that contains the people table element, is going to update automatically at the time when we update that variable. Okay, so that's really the pattern for all of this interaction between the API and Vue, is go fish up some data from the API and then set some reactive variable appropriately with the data that it's expecting, and then the user interface will update automatically. We're also doing a catch here to check for an error case. And the role list operates quite similarly. It's using that same weird looking HTTP thing. It's going to issue a GET request to API v1 people role. So they're in the people server, and we know where to find that now. There's going to be an endpoint here called persons that's going to give us back all the persons. Here we're going to get all of the roles back. We take a look at that, and we kind of post-process this and update eventually this roles list, which is one of our reactive variables. And that's going to be passed to, for example, the roles table. And the reactivity system will ensure that causes things to be updated. So in this particular case, we're only showing code that's going to be invoking these two functions here at the time that the component is first displayed in the application. We can also call these methods from elsewhere. So in fact, one of this event here that's defined on the person table, so say fetch people list, allows us to let the person table emit an event when you click like a refresh button in the person table. And when that event takes place, when it's detected by the framework, it's going to actually call fetch people list. It's going to call this function here to refresh that page as necessary. So we can make use of these methods multiple times in different contexts. Very similar to the way that we can invoke methods on a bona fide class in a language like Python or TypeScript or even in JavaScript now. So I promised we'd say a little bit about this weird $HTTP thing, and I claimed that it was an HTTP client. If I click through here, I guess I got multiple choices. Here's our UI source plugins. I mentioned just briefly before that's kind of where we configure third-party classes or modules that we're using. So let's jump through to that. So I'm now in the plugins directory here, and I've got a plugin called Axios.js. So Axios is a very, very popular library that's used to do requests. I think one of its claims to fame is that it works both in the browser and in a Node application, and you can use it to make any kind of HTTP request, process the results, and that kind of stuff. And it's kind of evolved to be quite a common module that's used in a lot of single-page applications. So this axios.js file here is going to define for us and provide access for us to that underlying library. So if I look here in the imports from this file, we can see, for example, that we're bringing in Axios. So that's, again, a third-party module that we installed with NPM. And we're loading it in here so that we can create this object that we use to access the various endpoints in the API. So in this particular case, we're doing a little bit of customization. We're calling Axios's create method, and it gets a kind of an object that configures it to give it a base URL. And now we have an instance of that Axios element that we can use to make requests. But of course, we saw before that it was stored in a thing called $HTTP, and that's actually accomplished right here. So Vue, that's the top level Vue class. And you know that JavaScript uses prototypal inheritance, right? So when you look for a method on a particular JavaScript object, you check to see if it's a property of that object, and if it is, you call it, and if it isn't, you look up the prototype chain to find out if it's in one of the parent components, and the link between one object and the next is this thing called prototype. So what we're doing here is we're creating a function called $HTTP right on the Vue object itself, and this is a little hinky in a way. I feel like I wish there was an API that does this so that it wasn't quite so brutal in terms of just going in and forcing that prototype of Vue to have this $HTTP, but it's efficient and it's a convention, and it's not quite the Wild West because you're using this kind of weird name for that property. So we're basically just taking that Axios object that we had created up above, and we're assigning it to this $HTTP. And that's just a convention in Vue that if you have a $HTTP object defined on the Vue class, it's going to be the HTTP client that your application is going to use. So that's all that's going on there. And now if we invoke a method on $HTTP, it's going to call this instance of the Axios object and make that web request and send back the results like we just saw. Now, one thing to maybe offer some clarification is we're defining this $HTTP on the Vue class itself. But if we scoot back to the code where we were looking at before, we can see that we're accessing it through this. Well, it turns out that this is actually an instance of the Vue class. So this configuration object that we've been talking about here that basically is the main body of the script tag, if I collapse this down, we'll see that there's nothing else in here except this exported object, right? So we're giving configuration information to configure this Vue object, but it's a Vue object, right? Which means that when we talk about this, we're referring to an instance of that Vue class, and that's where that $HTTP has been associated with the Axios client. And that's why we can access it in this fashion rather than having to sort of import the global Vue object. We just know that, hey, we're a Vue component, and this happens to be the portion of the Vue component that has the JavaScript, has the functionality, and therefore we can access all of the capabilities that are defined for us on that Vue object. There's a lot more to say about building Vue apps. Again, I would really encourage you to spend an hour or two reading through the guide that I pointed you to earlier from the Vue documentation. It's really well written, really clear examples, lots of little code snippets to help you clarify your understanding. It's worth that investment to be able to understand kind of what's going on under the hood. But all of the components, I mean, we can see there's a lot of them. I haven't drilled down into a ton of this code base. There's a lot of components. They're all structured the same way. The template area for markup that uses Vuetify components to display things in a nice fashion. The script tag that has all of the functionality, and it consists of just a single configuration object that we've seen here that's being exported so that other modules can import it. And then in a few cases in our code base, this style tag at the end that lets you tweak the visual presentation. Once you kind of get that model in your head and learn how to kind of jump from one component to another in your IDE, it's pretty easy to figure out what's going on. The other thing, again, let me emphasize the importance of using that Vue DevTools package. We're looking here kind of at the static structure of the code, right? I mean, we've been talking about this page for some while, and we know now that it's got a person table and a roles table. But if we were coming to this cold, we wouldn't, we'd have to go dope out that structure. If we were trying to debug something on the people page in the application, though, and we fired up that Vue DevTools view, it would allow us to see the actual runtime configuration of the different components as they used one another and as they passed data back and forth. Remember I showed you that view of the data in the Vue DevTools debugger. It's actually showing you the real current components of this information. So you can see exactly the state that's encapsulated by each component and how those components are nested and how events flow back and forth and how they pass arguments from one component to the next, all inside that Vue debugger. So great to be able to grok the code, but also really important to be able to see that code in action as a way to do debugging.